To this afternoon's Institute for Government webinar. We're going to be looking at what we learned from the Labour Manifesto that was launched just a few hours ago. I'm Emma Norris, the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. Keir Starmer was in Manchester to unveil Labour's 131-page plan for power. There weren't any surprises, or in the Labour leader's words, no rabbits being pulled from hats and no pantomimes either. So what do we get? Does it add up? Will the electorate like what they've heard? And what does this manifesto tell us about what a Labour Party might do or not do if they find themselves in government on the 5th of July? To discuss all of this, I'm joined by a trio of experts, our Chief Economist, Gemma Tetlow, Stuart Hoddinott, who's a senior researcher in our public services team, and Sam Freedman, a former government policy advisor and the author of a new book, Failed State: Why Nothing Works and How We Fix It. Please do start sending in your questions on the Slido bar, which is just next to the live feed, and we'll try to get in as many as possible. But first of all, I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to start with a few questions of our own. Sam, what did you make of the manifesto? Did we learn any more about what a Labour government would mean for the country?
Not really. I mean, there was nothing new in it, and that sounds like it was quite a deliberate decision not to have rabbits and not to try and make a pantomime out of it, as you say. That doesn't mean there's nothing interesting in it. There's quite a lot of ideas in there that if they'd been announced for the first time today, people would be saying, oh, that's quite radical, especially when you put it all together. I think what really struck me is how lopsided it is. On the sort of economic side, when it comes to industrial strategy, house building, and so on, and plans for energy and climate change, it's almost so ambitious that you think this isn't really viable certainly by 2030. And then in the public services section, you think, where's the ambition at all? And where's the money, more to the point, to do anything substantive? So there's a really split between something that feels really kind of punchy and something that doesn't feel punchy at all. And because I spend most of my time working on the public services side, I think I'm a bit disappointed about that side of it. And what's odd when you read it is that their diagnosis of the problem is often both correct and very drastic. You read the health section and you're sort of, thinking, yep, it's terrible. 7.5 million people on waiting list. They've gone up again today. Ambulance waiting times, this is all terrible. And then you get to sort of, well, we're going to have some new MRI scanners. Well, that's not going to fix that problem, is it? So there's also a disconnect between the acknowledgement of how bad things are and the ambition in the plans on the public sector side. Elsewhere, there is more ambition. So it's a kind of strange mix, but there's a lot to unpack.
And that disconnect that you described, Sam, do you think that's kind of inevitable in the political context that we're in, or do you think we could have seen a manifesto that met the challenge more head on?
So I think obviously public sector reform, putting money into solving the NHS and problems and sort of policing and criminal justice problems would cost a lot of money. They don't want to spend a lot of money because they don't want to say they're going to put up taxes. We're in a constrained sort of position when it comes to borrowing. So it's understandable from that point of view. But I don't think that means you can't have a vision or an approach for what public sector reform should look like, even if it's to say this is the kind of approach we want to take when we're able to afford it. And to just have nothing really apart from a few, there's some small policies which are perfectly fine, but to say we've got a massive problem with child poverty and then say, oh, we're going to do some breakfast clubs, there's just this, it feels like you could say there's more we'd like to do when we can.
And on the kind of question of vision, one of the things that Labour has kind of brought out again in the manifesto and has been a kind of a running theme throughout the campaign and beyond is missions and mission government, this idea of doing a more joined up, much longer term way of approaching the country's kind of problems. Do we know more about what mission government means in practice after the manifesto today?
Not really. I mean, the missions have been something they've been talking about for quite a long time. I think they do seem quite sincere about trying to follow that approach in government. But I think it will require quite a rewiring of the way Whitehall operates. We've seen some acknowledgement of that in briefings and so on, but nothing in the manifesto that would explain how that would happen. And the bit that I think is particularly tricky is the relationship between the Treasury and Number 10. The Treasury have tended to control the spending review process historically. And if Number 10 are controlling the missions and the Treasury are controlling the spending review process, then there are going to be some fairly obvious clashes and disconnects there as well. So I think there has been some thinking going on about how to do that better, but it's not really visible at this stage in the manifesto.
Thanks, Sam. Gemma, Sam started to talk about some of the spending challenges. There have been lots of rows about tax. They've really been at the forefront of the campaign so far. Starmer's ruled out raising the 4 major taxes. Is that going to put an end to the Conservative attacks? And I guess more broadly, is this a sensible approach to tax policy making?
Yes, I think the discussion about tax has been really unfortunate in this election campaign as a whole. As you say, the focus from the questions from the media, the questions from the other parties about are you going to raise X, Y, Z tax has just seemed to have pushed both the major parties into ruling out increases in any of the big taxes. So Labour have ruled out increases in essentially 3/4 of the taxes that the government raises each year. And for the reasons that Sam says, there are really big pressures on public spending, and the public spending plans that both Labour and the Conservatives are implicitly signed up to are incredibly tight and require big cuts to particularly the criminal justice system. And so there's a real, in a sense, by ruling out all of those tax rising opportunities, there's an implicit choice to prioritise that over making money available for dealing with a lot of those public spending pressures. And I think that hasn't really been spelt out to the electorate and will make it very hard after the election to actually make some of those trade-offs and has shut down a lot of options. Now, I think your question about tax policy making, I think one thing here is that there are sensible changes you can make to the tax system, which actually, even if you weren't overall looking to raise taxes, might involve raising some bits of taxes in order to improve the structure and sort of promote economic growth. So it really does tie your hands on that.
And Gemma, as you say, this manifesto didn't really confront the implausible spending plans that are currently penciled in. Can we say that this manifesto is fully funded? Is Labour relying too heavily on growth?
I think what we've seen from Labour is the same thing that we saw in the Conservative manifesto, which is that there's a lot of focus on some tables which spell out specific takeaways and specific giveaways that superficially look like they are fully funded. But that really ignores the big elephant in the room, which is this public spending plans underlying that are so tight that they require cuts to public services and certainly not sufficient to deal with the sorts of chronic problems that Sam rightly says the Labour manifesto spells out. So it's sort of superficially fully funded on some specific pledges, but actually the big question is how are you kind of meeting the overall spending plans and matching those up to your ambitions?
And are you convinced by their plans for growth if they come up with a kind of plausible prescription for raising the long-term growth rate?
I think that the Labour manifesto rightly focuses on growth as an important objective of government. And I think in recent days, shadow ministers have tried to say, it'll be all right, we can deal with those difficult fiscal questions because growth is going to come to our aid. I think that's a bit disingenuous. Even if you do very well on policies to promote growth, they're not going to come around quickly enough to avoid any difficult fiscal choices in the next Parliament. But if we take those sort of growth plans in and of themselves, even accepting that those take time to pay off, I think there's lots of ambition there. As Sam said, there's big ambitions on planning reform, on net zero infrastructure, talk about a return of stability and a new industrial strategy. There's a national wealth fund. There's lots of bits to this. So certainly positives and good to be ambitious. I think a few caveats around that. One is that there seems to be a lot of emphasis placed on the role of government in working with the private sector to promote growth. That may be important for some sectors of the economy, but actually a lot of the economy doesn't need government to work with it. It just needs a stable policy environment to get on and do whatever it needs to do. Secondly, I think while it's good to be specific in some areas, there's perhaps almost too much specificity in things like what's said around how the National Wealth Fund will be used. I mean, there's actually quite a long list of $1.5 billion. It's going to go to new gigafactories and some quite specific things that I think actually are almost too much detail at this point in the cycle. And it does definitely duck some tough choices on growth policies. There are some areas where it could just be win-win, but there are other areas where things like better infrastructure that either has to be paid for through, for example, higher utility bills or through higher taxes. And the manifesto is not specific about actually what choices they're going to make on those sorts of things.
Thanks, Gemma. Sam, you were talking about the level of ambition in parts of the manifesto. Planning reform seems really central to Labour's plans for growth. Do you think Labour are going to have the kind of courage, the ability to succeed where so many previous governments have made promises that have ultimately come to nothing?
I think they think that they do. I think the interesting thing is they're going to find themselves having quite a few more rural MPs, I think, given, well, assuming the polls are sort of vaguely correct, in a few weeks' time. And they're not used to having rural MPs who might have a different view on planning reform to some of the more urban ones. So that will be a challenge. I think also there are just some really basic logistical challenges. There aren't enough people working in planning in local authorities to ramp up at the speed that they're currently proposing to ramp up at. And I can't see any money to hire all of those people, and local government finances are in a total mess. So I think you've got a mix of logistical challenges and potential political challenges when various sort of environmental agencies and MPs start saying, wait a minute, we didn't actually sign up for this down the line.
I want to come on to public services now. We've touched on it a bit already, but Stuart, what's your take on the diagnosis of the problems that was offered in the manifesto, and how do the solutions that were offered measure up against that?
Yeah, I think, as Sam mentioned, the diagnosis in the manifesto is broadly correct, and also I think that's not that unexpected given the state of public services they are and the fact that this is the opposition party's manifesto. It's very easy for them to stand on the outside and diagnose serious problems in public services, especially when those do exist. Some of the language is quite dramatic. Financial crisis and local government, definitely agree with that. Terrible performance in the NHS also aligns with what we find as well. So I think that's definitely that's definitely borne out by the manifesto. I think that there is less detail on the solutions, as Sam said, and especially compared to the Conservative manifesto a couple of days ago. That was sort of notable actually for how extensive there was, how extensive detail was for some service areas. But then also that's also to be expected a little bit. They are in government. They have the civil service who are making policy for them. They have a bit more firepower to provide that detail. I think potentially as well, Labour leave themselves a little bit of space to get into government and see exactly the extent of the difficulties when they get there. But I think there were some ambitious things in there as well, maybe counter to what Sam was saying. Things like hitting the elective 18-week target by the end of next Parliament would be a miraculous turnaround in hospitals. That would really be quite an astounding thing to do. A greater focus on prevention is really, really welcome. That comes out in a number of different areas in the document. So I think there are some areas where they do push the ambition maybe a little bit further.
And so just taking the health mission, for instance, do you think the pledges kind of met the scale of the challenge that we're seeing there? It sounds like the answer is yes on elective waiting lists. What about the rest of it?
I mean, to lay out the challenge is very extensive in the health system, not just hospitals, but also in general practice. Mental health services are nowhere near sufficient to deal with the level of demand. Community services are also underfunded. So there is just really, really difficult problems to deal with all across the health system. Having said that, if they achieve everything in the manifesto that they want to achieve, they also talk about shifting more care into the community and improving public health investment and policymaking. I think that would really be quite a dramatic shift over the course of one Parliament. And it's something that a lot of governments have talked about, but often failed to deliver. So I think there is a genuine ambition that could meet the scale of those challenges, but it would be difficult to do still. And there still needs to be detail fleshed out. But again, that will probably come if and when they get into government.
And Stuart, last week we published our precarious state of the state report that showed that the criminal justice system in particular is at crisis point at the moment. What kind of solutions are offered in today's manifesto, and how far does it get into the longer term as well as the kind of acute crisis right now?
Yeah, again, really difficult situation in the criminal justice system, and the acute crisis is almost all-consuming. Prisons are basically completely full. The court system is the highest backlog on record. But I think there is a good balance in there between looking at some of the short-term things, but also thinking about the longer term. So again, that emphasis on prevention and early intervention is really, really welcome. Positive language around rehabilitation is also very, very positive. On the sort of policing front, a focus on neighbourhood policing is also a really good change to just talking about warrant officers. And we think there's better value for money from hiring PCSOs than for expanding the warranted officer police force like they have done recently. But we think probably the most impactful thing that they announced, which is maybe a bit quieter, was the review of sentencing policy. That's probably the one biggest lever they could pull to really impact the prison population. It would also be quite low cost. It doesn't really cost anything to change sentencing policy, but it would be implicitly quite contentious as well. So yeah, I think there is a good balance there between longer and shorter term stuff in the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Stuart. Sam, we've got lots of questions coming in from people watching about what you make of what Labour had to say on education and childcare, and indeed lots of questions on what you make of what they said on HE as well. So over to you.
Okay, on the education side, let's start with the youngest children and go up. I mean, so childcare, they have essentially adopted the government's position, but also said that they've also paid more attention to the market than the government have been doing, which is good and important. They want primary schools to provide a lot of the new places that will be needed, which is not, I think, is a reasonable policy solution. I am worried they don't actually have any levers to make primary schools do it. Well, money would be the lever, but presumably they don't want to use that in terms of revenue anyway. So this feels like a number that they have sort of plucked out of the air because it creates 100,000 places without actually talking to many primary schools. So that one, I think, is a sort of an implementation question, but the theory makes sense given we have falling roles in primary schools. The education section, I do find it a bit frustrating because I think there is a real lack of an overall kind of vision of what they want the school system to be and do. There's some perfectly fine individual policies. Breakfast clubs for primaries are great. I mean, there's good evidence for those, and most primaries already have something. So it's not as if I sort of disagree with anything. It's more just that there are so many big questions about what, half our schools are academies, half of them are state sort of maintained schools still. Do they have any view on what they want that to look like? Do they have sort of any view on the relationship between children's services and schools? We have massive problems with special educational needs, with children's mental health, all trends that are going in the wrong direction. There are some small policies in there that might mitigate a bit, but nothing really substantive that sort of gets to the heart of those problems. So I found the schools sort of section inoffensive in a sense, but also like not meeting the challenge of what's necessary. And then as for HE, there's we'll sort this out when we're in government. There's very, very little, and there's an acknowledgement of the problem, which is that the funding system is not working for anybody right now because we've got flat tuition fees that aren't going up with inflation when costs are. So it's putting huge financial pressure on HE institutions. While students still are unhappy with it. So they've acknowledged the problem, but they haven't even suggested any kind of, they even suggested a review, but they have said they'll do something.
And before we move away from public services, we've obviously, almost all of you have kind of made the point that there's a real acknowledgement of the scale of the challenge, but actually meeting that challenge is really difficult in the context of current spending plans. Now, one of the questions we have from the audience is, without breaking any of the kind of careful public commitments Labour have made around tax and so on, what are the best options for raising substantial extra revenue so a new government isn't forced to disappoint what lots of people are expecting, whether that's on the NHS, schools, housing, or so on? Who wants to jump in first there? Gemma?
Yeah, I'll have a bash. I'm not sure. I mean, as I said, by ruling out so much, unfortunately, you do rule out some of what might be the best economic options, at least for tax raising. So you've ruled out a lot of the broader spaces. But I guess there are two. Well, so some of the areas that Labour have not ruled out raising taxes are things like capital taxes and property taxes. Economically, our property taxes in particular are particularly poorly designed. So we raise a lot of money from transaction taxes like stamp duty when someone moves house, which just clogs up the housing market. On the other hand, we have a very regressive property tax in the council tax, which not only is based on house price values in 1991, but also means you pay a much larger percentage of your house value if you live in a low value property than you do if you live in a high value property. So council tax is absolutely ripe for reform. You could do that in a way that didn't raise any extra money, but would just mean people in London and the South East essentially paying more because their property values are more valuable relative to 1991 than people living elsewhere in the country. You could also do that sort of thing in a way that raised you money as well overall. So that's perhaps an area that hasn't been ruled out. It's ripe for economically enhancing tax reform and could be done in such a way that you raise money from relatively well-off people if that's something that Labour were looking to do.
Thanks, Gemma. Sam, Stuart, anything to add to Gemma's list?
Yeah, so I think on the public services side, there's a few things that could be done. Maybe to flip the question on its head a little bit, is not new sources of revenue, but a better way to spend existing envelopes might be a better way of framing that as well in public services. So I think we talk a lot about, and Gemma's team's been doing some work on better use and better ways to spend existing capital budgets. For example, longer term settlements to allow services to plan their spend more effectively over a longer period of time. The Labour Party actually committed to this in the manifesto, but longer term settlements for local government is also really welcome to see. And then I think on the prevention side, which they talk about a lot, we talk about preventative spending and preventative services very often, but there's also a whole side of prevention that is things like better regulation of unhealthy foods, sin taxes on sugary drinks, that type of thing, which actually would be either revenue neutral or revenue raising and could potentially have an impact further down the line on demand for acute services. So I think there are still better ways of spending the existing budget and also affecting demand for services in a way that would not require more spending.
Fab, thanks, Stuart. Okay, let's look at some of the other areas in the manifesto. Net zero. Sam, I'm going to come to you on this. Making Britain a clean energy superpower is another one of Labour's missions. They've restated their ambition to deliver clean power by 2030. The Conservatives have really sought to try and make net zero a bit of a dividing line in this election. Do you think that Labour's plan for clean energy is credible? And do you think that this is a dividing line that Labour are willing to take on?
The politics is easier to answer than the policy one on this. I mean, Labour are delighted to have this as a dividing line. It's why they've sort of fully embraced it. I think they've looked at the polling carefully, and they know that while people do not enjoy having their taxes put up, they do care about the environment. It has been rising up the most important issues list, and they don't like the idea of sort of abandoning net zero. I think that has led them to be a little bit disingenuous in the way they sell the policy. So there's a sort of lot of this is going to save you money on your bills and it's going to be sort of free and it's actually going to be pretty expensive. And again, I think there's probably a bit of a disconnect between the level of ambition that they've got in the manifesto to do a lot of things by 2030 and the amount of money that has been put towards it, given that they scaled back their original sort of 28 billion a year pledge that they were going to put towards this agenda. I am not an expert in sort of energy policy, so I'm not going to pretend to sort of be one. But the people who are experts, that does seem to be their sort of general view of this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. Stuart, we've got lots of questions coming through on devolution. Is devolution an area in England that Labour and the Conservatives are on roughly the same page? What do you make of Labour's proposals?
Yeah, again, I'm going to say I'm not a massive expert on devolution, but I've been paying enough attention, I think, to give this a good stab. I think that broadly the Conservatives and Labour are more or less on the same page for devolution. We've seen a massive expansion of English devolution under the Conservative governments, and Labour want to do the same thing. I think potentially Labour have a bit of a clearer view on what role they want mayors to play. They want to take on more of a role around adult education and forming the local economy, that type of thing. So I think there is some differences. And yeah, I think that it's notable that both parties sort of dropped the levelling up term in this election. It's not really featuring in either party's manifesto, but I think Labour has sort of taken on quite a few of the some of the ideas for it. Things like more regional growth to try and even out regional inequalities. So yeah, I think there's probably not loads of difference between them, but Labour seem keen to push it further than it has been currently.
Sam?
Yeah, I think on devolution, I agree that it's quite similar to the current government plans, what's expressed in the manifesto. And I think it's actually good that they're both sort of in agreement on this point. I think the question that will become a really important one as we go through the Parliament is around whether you're going to give mayors tax raising powers, because at the moment, mayors are supplicants. They get money from central government, and when they get money and they're able to spend it, they look good. And when they don't get money, they can say, well, it's Westminster's fault that we didn't get any money. And this has been a problem with Scottish devolution as well, which they now do have tax raising powers. So I think you're going to get this growing question as to how much do we really believe in devolution, and a real signal of that, not necessarily the big taxes, but even if it's just sort of smaller things like tourist taxes and so on, are we going to let them raise their own money? So they have to take responsibility for what they're doing in their area and what they're spending, and what, if they say we can't do this, they have choices. So and that will be in the context of nearly all the mayors being Labour mayors, and potentially quite a lot of tension between them and what they want to do and what the centre want to do. So I think it's going to be a really interesting agenda to watch over the next few years.
And I wonder if we should touch on local government finances, which we know are in an appalling state. Gemma, do you think any of the suggestions we've seen in the manifesto will help local government out of the kind of fiscal hole that it's in at the moment?
I think the real challenge in local government finances is that local government finances were cut quite significantly over the last decade and a half. I think in part because it was less obvious where those cuts would end up happening, and what local government has ended up doing is essentially having to channel its resources into the sort of statutory acute end of their services, and funding for the nice to have but not immediately necessary things like libraries, youth services, etc., have been cut back. I mean, in terms of what's in the policies, I think there's nothing majorly there that's going to change that picture. In a sense, local government finances going forwards are perhaps looking slightly better than some areas of public services, almost because local government is now less reliant on grants coming from central government and more reliant on local tax raising powers. And those local taxes are expected to grow more quickly than public spending as a whole will be over the next few years. But that does mean that there's quite a variation across the country in how much local councils are able to raise from local businesses and council tax. So increasingly, there's a danger that you get very different outcomes in different parts of the country, depending on how able they are to raise extra revenues from council tax.
Stuart?
Yeah, completely agree with everything Gemma said. I think that there are the number one thing we hear from local authorities that we talk to is frustration and a lack of understanding for why they can't have longer term settlements, and a feeling that, you know, the cliff edge they get to in March every year is really damaging for their ability to deliver good value for money. So I think that would be welcomed, the Labour commitment, that would be welcomed. Also, the recognition that competitive funding pots are not that effective way of funding local government, and a reduction in sort of small pots of money, I think would also help. But I completely agree with Gemma. The problems are systemic and deep in local government, and often also worse in the more deprived bits of the country. So there is a real sort of disparity and inequality issue in local government funding that is not really addressed in this manifesto.
Thanks, Stuart. I want to talk a little bit about constitution and trust. Sam, what did you make of the wider proposals for constitutional reform and relations with the devolved nations and regions? I guess what I'm asking is kind of how far has Labour gone on the Brown Commission ideas, and do we believe that the House of Lords is really going to be reformed?
So there's bits of the Brown Commission work in there, but it's quite vague. The things that they've committed to are pretty small, getting rid of the final 92 hereditary peers, and quite oddly having an age limit of 80, which that I'm not quite sure why you'd pick that as I think it's a way of trying to reduce the size, which does make sense. It's too big, the House of Lords, but it's a bit of an arbitrary way to do it. There are actually some pretty good peers over the age of 80 who would be a shame to lose. Then they've sort of said, and in the longer term, we'll do a big reform and replace it with a second chamber, and we'll come back to that later. And they said that in '97 and never got around to it. I wouldn't be wildly surprised if the same thing happened this time, or it became a term 2, term 3 question. It's the sort of thing that absorbs an enormous amount of time for not a huge amount of political benefit. I actually, there's a lot in my book about this, but I actually think the Commons is a much bigger problem than the Lords, and the Commons doesn't work very well, and that's where our real problems are. Is there's very little scrutiny in our main sort of parliamentary chamber, and there's nothing on that in the manifesto, because presumably they don't want to restrict their ability to rush stuff through the Commons. But that's actually where we've seen the problems, certainly with the previous government, with the current government, and I'd have liked to have seen a bit of an acknowledgement of that.
And Sam, we saw earlier this week that public trust in government is at record lows at the moment. Do you think Labour have kind of convincing plans that are going to go about restoring that trust in government?
I think just government not being so chaotic, if they are able to achieve that, would go some way towards improving it. But it's been dropping for a long time now, quite consistently. And I do think there is a lot of this is connected to the way the media operates and the sort of media environment in which politicians are operating. There is this huge demand to make constant announcements in order to fill the news cycle. That by making announcements all the time, and especially making announcements that are designed to appeal to certain newspapers, you're constantly setting yourself up to fail when it comes to actually delivering on any of those things. And we've seen that over and over again with the current government. So I was actually quite pleased to see Starmer say today there's no rabbits, and that's actually a positive thing. If they actually stick to that in government, I think it will help enormously, because they might be able to stick to some of their promises rather than constantly announcing stuff that they then don't deliver.
Thanks, Sam. So no rabbits, but Gemma, I did see that Ed Balls on his podcast with George Osborne described the manifesto as a straitjacket, which could end up boxing Labour in. What do you make of that? And if it is a straitjacket, how can Labour break out of it if they do end up in government in a few weeks' time?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to hear Ed say that, because he obviously knows more about the politics and the reality of this. We were looking back to the '97 Labour manifesto and reminding ourselves that at that point, Labour ruled out any increases in income tax, but not the other taxes. And notably, the Labour government then did go on to increase national insurance contributions later, as part of making more money available for the health service, or at least that was the sales pitch. So I think it's very interesting to hear him say that he thinks this will genuinely tie the hands of a future Labour government. And I guess the most recent experience we have was in 2017, when Philip Hammond tries to raise self-employed national insurance contributions, and that ultimately fell apart when Laura Kuenssberg pointed out that it was contrary to the preceding Tory manifesto. So I think that is interesting. It is concerning that they may be tied in that way, given the very tough choices and difficult inheritance that the next government is likely to get. I suppose the one thing we haven't talked about at all on this podcast so far that may be the margin of adjustment is the precise details of the fiscal rules. Now, so the Labour manifesto says that they would borrow only to invest, and they would have debt falling in 5 years' time. There's some wiggle room within that. So, for example, they could pick a slightly different measure of debt, and that would give you a slightly different level of headroom. I guess what we've been trying to advocate for is actually, let's not play around with the details of the rules and game them and bend ourselves over backwards to try and meet the letter but not the spirit of those kind of rules. I guess we think it would be better for a government to come in and actually just make a strong case for why there is a rationale for perhaps borrowing more in the near term because it has longer term benefits, whether it's for the green transition or for other types of investment that are expected to deliver longer term benefits, even if that means debt rising somewhat in the near term. But I think if I was putting my more pragmatic political hat on, I could see there are ways that you could tweak the existing rules, or there are proposals that have been doing the rounds on things like changing the interest paid on Bank of England reserves that would also somewhat reduce measured public borrowings. I think there are things that are not raising headline taxes or cutting headline public spending that may be the way to slightly square this circle.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I just want to take a few more audience questions. I am very pleased to see, given that it's IfG, that the most popular audience question is about machinery of government changes. Thank you, audience. Sam, I'm going to come to you on this one. Labour haven't said very much about civil service or machinery of government changes. What changes do you think Sue Gray and indeed the kind of broader Starmer team are likely to pursue in trying to deliver these manifesto commitments? And I suppose, particularly when it comes to missions, what kind of changes might we see?
I think there's some disagreement within Labour about how radical to be on this front. I think you've seen a sort of what I consider sort of tweak ideas, such as having, mission-based cabinet committees rather than departmental-based cabinet committees, which is sort of, fairly low level, or, right the way through to having an executive cabinet, which would be quite a big move. And some prime ministers in the past have wanted to have an executive cabinet where you have 4 or 5 people making the big decisions, supported by the wider cabinet. We sort of had that a bit during the coalition with the Quad, but they could try and formalise that. It's quite interesting because, of course, Sue Gray was in the cabinet office for a very long time in a senior role. Keir Starmer was a senior civil servant. Director of Public Prosecutions is a permanent secretary level civil servant, and he saw how the civil service worked more than previous prime ministers have done. So they do have more of an idea of what they're about to hit, and they will surely know the degree to which, if you want to achieve any of these kind of very ambitious goals, you will need to engage in some kind of reform of the way the civil service works. But I'm unclear as to how much priority time they're willing to commit to that, and I'm unclear whether they're really willing to change the role of the head of the civil service to give them the space to do that properly. That's obviously Simon Case at the moment. It's probably going to be somebody else fairly soon. The person they pick for that and how much of a priority they give to that bit of the job versus the day-to-day firefighting, I think will tell us quite a lot about how serious they are on machinery of government and civil service reform.
Thanks, Sam. And that's a perfect moment for me to plug the Institute's own work in this space. We published our Centre Commission looking at how to reform the centre of government and argued for a split in the Cabinet Secretary and Head of Civil Service roles to make sure that the Head of Civil Service role gets the attention that it needs. So do have a look at that, people watching, if you're interested. Gemma, one of the other questions coming in from the audience, what do you think is the most important policy area in the manifesto or most important idea that the manifesto didn't mention, that didn't get enough airtime?
I mean, I think for me, it's the big picture trade-offs that we're not talked about. And I think that's the thing that the new government is going to have to grapple with quite early. I mean, I think the missions for Labour, if they were to gain office, are a good starting point in having a clear sense of what are your priorities. And I suppose what we've been arguing IfG is that you should translate that early into a clear programme for government that can then shape your subsequent choices. And to go back to the point Sam made earlier, in recent times, there's been very much a tendency for spending reviews, spending settlements to be very much a Treasury-driven thing, making the numbers add up. But in making the numbers add up, the Treasury has implicitly imposed its own priorities about where the money goes and what the trade-offs are. I think if the Labour government were to come in and want to make a success of its ambitions, then that prioritisation process needs to be owned at the centre. Those trade-offs need to be clearly chosen, not just by the Treasury, but by the centre, by a core group of the cabinet. So I think for me, that was perhaps the one bit that arguably you wouldn't expect to be in the manifesto, but it's those trade-offs that I think will be absolutely crucial and were not in any way hinted at or set out in the manifesto.
Thanks, Gemma. And Stuart, I want to come to you now on social care and hear a bit more about your analysis of the commitments that were made on social care, the idea of a national care service. Does the manifesto go far enough?
Yeah, thanks for that. I was actually kicking myself from having mentioned social care, so glad that someone else brought it up. Obviously the National Care Service is the big shiny announcement in this, although it's not an announcement, it's a sort of a re-upping of something they've already announced. I think it's still very vague from the manifesto what exactly it means. They talk about national standards of care. I think that is a legitimate thing to want, but it should also be the case right now that the CQC should be holding providers and also now local authorities to account for the quality of care they provide. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what it's going to be. I think it's going to be a nice shiny badge, but beyond that, at the minute, it's a bit vague. Although they do acknowledge that that's something that they'll sort of come to later on. I think the big one that they talk about, and one that we've talked about a lot in our work, is a minimum wage for carers. I think that would go some way to redressing some of the major workforce crises in the sector. I think it's still a little bit unclear again how exactly that would work, and it is complicated because the government doesn't have a direct lever to pay social carers. They have to go through local authorities, then pay providers, then pay carers. So there's a long chain of causality before you can get to carers still. But if they can do it, and if they can find sufficient money to increase wages because it would cost money, then it would potentially be a really big difference for the sector. But also worth saying that there are other things that are important for the care workforce, pay differentials, progression, better training. The Labour Manifesto does talk about those things as well, but I think the really sort of big eye-catching one would be the sector-wide pay.
Thanks, Stuart. Sam, we've had quite a few questions come in about the EU. Were you expecting a warmer statement about EU-UK relationships, particularly given that Lammy's made a few relatively ambitious statements?
No, I wasn't. I think they've made it pretty clear that their holding position is they're going to make Brexit work. I do not think they will, in fact, make Brexit work. So I think that position will change over time. And I think, again, this is going to be one of the really interesting dynamics of the next 5 years, is if we don't see the kind of economic growth that would be needed to get us out of the hole we're in. And given that we're probably going to have a chamber full of MPs, almost all of whom backed for and voted for Remain, and given that the demographics of the country are shifting more and more towards people who voted for Remain or would have voted for Remain, how long can they hold off this conversation of a closer sort of whether it's sort of customs union, single market, etc. I suspect it will become quite a big issue, and maybe in the second half of the Parliament rather than the first, but maybe sooner than that. And I suspect it will be a real tense dynamic within Labour as to what to do with that, especially if the Lib Dems are the opposition, because they actually have a rejoining the single market in their manifesto. So that would be interesting to know. You can get better odds on the Lib Dems being the opposition than you can on a Tory majority, which is unusual for an election. So if that happens, then that will be a really interesting debate.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to end with the same question to all of you. After 14 years of a Conservative or a Conservative-led government, does this manifesto suggest that if Labour won, it would do government in a radically different way to what we've seen for so long? Stuart, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks. I'm going to talk about what I know best, public services. I think, again, if they could seriously implement the changes that they discuss in this manifesto, it would be a radically different approach to public services. An increased focus on prevention would be very different to the way it is now. We've spent 14 years sort of jumping from acute crisis to acute crisis and policy making to plug sort of short-term gaps. I think that would be a very different way to take a longer-term view and to think about things like the health of the nation and what it would take to improve educational outcomes in the longer term. So I think that really would be quite radical. I think there are other things, though, that would be more of the same. Like there is still talk about elective waiting lists, and there's still talk about getting people, criminals off the street and knife crime. So I think there's a mixture there between radically different stuff, which is very ambitious, and sort of then business as usual. We have to try and keep things going because there's not a lot of money type stuff that is in there as well. So a mixture, I would say.
Gemma.
Couple of areas I pick out where maybe there is potential for change. So one area in fiscal policy in recent years, I think we really have got into a cycle of a lot of chopping and changing of tax policies and a lot of responding. So every time the forecast changes, we see money being given away or money being taken away. And I think there is some suggestions in the Labour manifesto that they would be trying to take a more longer term approach to fiscal policy making, perhaps trying to tie their hands a little bit more in particular talking about having only one major fiscal event a year, and having a commitment that any kind of significant fiscal changes would be accompanied by a forecast from the OBR, which is obviously sort of pushing back against the Liz Truss quasi-quarting experience. I'm positive about those kind of noises. I slightly hesitate to get too enthusiastic about whether that will happen in practice, because we've had a lot of previous chancellors come in and say that they will only have one fiscal event a year and not have quite the same sort of churn and rabbits out of hats in budgets. But when push comes to shove, they show that actually they rather like multiple fiscal events a year. And so I suppose the question is whether a new Labour chancellor would be any more likely to stay constrained by those things. Second area, I guess, to pick out would be around industrial strategy. I mean, that's one thing that the Labour Manifesto talks very openly about. It talks very much about a partnership between government and the private sector. That is in sharp contrast to the current government. So Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will not use the terms industrial strategy. But obviously, we've had a lot of change under the Conservative governments the past 14 years, going through phases when industrial strategy was a thing and then less of a thing. So I think that would be a change, certainly from where we are now, but perhaps would be more similar to what we had under the coalition government and under Theresa May's premiership.
Thanks, Gemma. Sam, you get the last word.
I don't think the approach is that radical. I think the prioritization is very different. And I think that will feel even more true once we're into the parliament and you have swapped a parliament that consists mostly of quite right-wing Eurosceptic backbenchers to one that consists mostly of people who work for Save the Children and the NHS. I think it's just going to feel very, very different. And the demands that are being placed on the government by their own side are going to be so different that it will force probably a more radical shift than it might feel like at the moment, both in terms of that prioritization, but also in terms of the approaches they have to end up taking, even if they're not talking about them now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. Thanks to all our panellists. That's all we've got time for now. But if you want to see the rest of what our IfG experts think about today's announcements, then you can check out a piece that we've just put up on our website looking at the 10 things we learned from the Labour Manifesto. Do have a look, have a read. Otherwise, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks again to our panellists. Thanks everyone.